Hi there, you're listening to the Business Storyteller Podcast by Piktochart, and welcome to Season 2. In this podcast, we speak with inspiring leaders who share their insights and experience in business and brand storytelling. Join us on this journey to learn how the art of storytelling can bring your businesses and brands to the next level. Hi there, and thank you for listening to the Business Storyteller Podcast. I'm your host, Wilson, and I'd like to start today's episode with this thought. As professionals, we all hang around on LinkedIn, but have you ever wondered how can you use LinkedIn more in depth to make the most of the platform? Well, today's guest is an expert in this area, and he will help us to understand how we can build our authority on LinkedIn with the power of storytelling. It's my privilege to speak with Konrad, who is the founder, CEO, and content strategist at the Creative Copywriter. The Creative Copywriter is a fast-growing content strategy and copywriting agency that blends art with science to help bold brands sell more stuff. They have worked together with brands like Adidas, Hyundai, TikTok, Geox, and plenty more. Konrad's mission is to break the boundaries of corporate dullness and help companies pierce through the noise with real talk, word science, and calculated creativity. Hi there, Konrad, and welcome to the Business Storyteller Podcast. Thank you for being here today. And how are you doing?
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Wilson. What a lovely introduction. I don't know how I could introduce myself any better. That was great. Thank you. I'm very excited to be here, ready and raring to answer your questions, to talk about LinkedIn and storytelling, two of my favorite subjects.
That's awesome. I'm looking forward to learning from you as well. But before we begin, I'm sure our listeners are curious to know you better from your own words instead of mine. So can you tell us more about your career journey and what led to your role as CEO at the Creative Copywriter?
Yeah, sure. So I guess this is the part where I tell you my story, right? Seeing as this is the Business Storyteller Podcast, I think you've kind of given a teaser as to the end of the story, which is great, as to where I am now. So, currently I co-run the Creative Copywriter, as you said, a copywriting and content strategy agency over here in London. You've mentioned and name dropped some of our biggest global clients. So, we're doing very well. We're growing very fast. We surpassed the million in revenue last year, and we're continuing to climb. You've given a bit of context as to who we are and what we do. That's the end of the story, right? So I'll go back to the beginning. A good place to start is maybe university. So many moons ago, I went to university. I went to study philosophy, which is kind of an interesting subject in that it sort of teaches you so much, but kind of perhaps doesn't give you quite little in terms of like a obvious career progression. It teaches you to think, critical thinking. And back then I wasn't the hardest working student, I'll admit that. But what I was very good at was writing, right? I was great at writing essays. I always liked writing stories as I was growing up as a sort of young teenager. And what I was good at university was kind of quite last minute, banging out these great essays, understanding how to write for my target audience, which, was actually a professor at that time. I left university with my philosophy degree. I went to Australia. So I went to travel, kind of work and travel. And that's where I met my current wife and also the managing director of our agency. So that's another teaser as to the end of the story there, Nitsan. And we kind of traveled around together for almost 2 years in Australia, Southeast Asia. And then I ended up she's from Israel. So I ended up in Israel without a work visa, in her parents' house, because it takes a while to get a work visa there. She was working. I had nothing to do, right? I was just there. But luckily for the internet, there's all kinds of things you can learn. And I kind of discovered and fell upon this amazing thing we call copywriting, which I didn't know existed, a way to essentially use writing skills as a profession, as a career. So I took some online courses in this gap of not being able to work. I studied copywriting. I also studied SEO, so search engine optimization. And I think the combination was very powerful because the great thing about SEO is that it's all about creating marketing ideas, business ideas based on demand rather than assumptions. It's about finding keywords. It's finding what people are actually searching for and are looking for, rather than just going, I call it outside in thinking rather than inside out thinking. So rather than going, I've got an idea for a business, let me throw all of my money into it, and then it fails. It's a massive fail because no one wants what you're offering. A great way to start a business is from the outside in, understanding what those SEO search terms are. I found an SEO search term called creative copywriting, creative copywriter. you probably can see where this story is going. And I realized that there was a lot of demand around the world. So high monthly search volume for creative copywriting, but not much competition. And I used that information to actually build a blog. I started writing about creative copywriting, teaching people, creating top funnel content to educate the world. And I did kind of, SEO best practices like backlinking, etc. Essentially, I started growing traffic to my blog. So I grew an audience. What I did from that, I then turned the blog into a freelancing website for myself. So I kind of was a freelance copywriter for a while. But I was always a bit of an entrepreneur, right? I think I liked the entrepreneurship more than the copywriting. To be honest, I was a little bit slow at copywriting as well. And it's important to kind of be quite fast. So what I did was I reached out to other copywriters that had, let's say, even a better portfolio than me, right? They'd already worked with big brands. And I said to them, hey, look, I've got a website. I've got traffic to this website for copywriting. Why don't we form a collective, put all of our portfolios together? It'll be even stronger, even more powerful. I'll bring in the traffic and then I'll kind of act as sort of a middleman. And kind of without realizing I was building an agency. I think at that time, this was about 8 to 10 years ago, I didn't even know what an agency was really at that time, but I was kind of creating one without knowing, but from a very good starting place. And that starting place is a website that has traffic, has demand, has people searching for you. And from then, I basically started building the business and building the agency. Branding was very important. So I always wanted to wear a hat, for example, and kind of have a strong brand, a brand that, if a big company, a big organization, a big brand like Adidas would land on the website, they would be impressed. They'd want to work with us. So having the traffic, having the brand, and then later having Nitsan, my partner in crime, join the agency as a much more process-driven person. That's when we really started to grow, because I'm more of the visionary, the entrepreneur type, the creative. But what you need in a company, I believe, in order to succeed and grow, is you need the organizational guru. You need someone like Nitsan, who's amazing with systems, who's amazing with deadlines, who's amazing at building structure and culture. And we kind of have a yin yang thing going on. So together, when she joined in 2017, that's when I say, or at least she says, that's when the agency really started, right? That's when we really started to grow. Well, at the time it was 90% growth. Now it's 40% year on year. And this is where I am today. So that's kind of the end of the story. Here we are, still growing. We have a team. We have an office in Greenwich and loving life. It's obviously a roller coaster, like most businesses, but that's the full story, I think.
Yeah, I love that story, and I think it's so inspiring to be able to hear like real life story on how the creative copywriter came about, and also I think the combination with you and your partner, to be able to bring it to where it is today. Very impressive growth numbers, like you said, 90% and 40% year-on-year growth now. That's really amazing. So kudos to you both and also the rest of the team. And thank you for such a great introduction they've given to us with yourself and also the creative copywriter. Now, let's start off with this question today. Now, based on your insight and experience over the years, let's talk about storytelling on LinkedIn. Why do you think brands and businesses should even care about that at the present time? And then maybe you can also talk about how do you think it will affect the future in the long term?
Okay, yes, good, very good questions. So I would say that I think there is a common challenge that is shared amongst brands, businesses, and also employees representing those brands, whether that's the CEO or any other employees that are kind of building their personal brand, which is happening a lot these days, especially on LinkedIn. That common challenge is, in a nutshell, noise, right? There's a lot of noise out there, not just on LinkedIn, everywhere online, right? There's a ton of content saturation, right? There's so many people posting content, so many brands, so many businesses that are fighting for your attention. And naturally, when we're out there representing a company, or if we are a company and we're posting on a company LinkedIn profile page, our challenge and our goal is to grab eyeballs, right? We're fighting to grab and grip attention and get those eyeballs on our content. So really what we're trying to do is pierce through that noise, right? So that's the kind of challenge and the goal. And the thing about storytelling for me is that storytelling really appeals to the primal brain, right? The primal part of our brain. For two reasons. I'm sure there's more than two reasons, but I'm going to give two reasons. First of all, we are naturally empathetic creatures, right? Humans are empaths by nature. Not all of us, but generally we are. I think evolutionary wise, that helped us build communities and social groups, and which is a huge part of what makes us human. That empathy essentially is what allows us to tap into a story. If someone's telling a story, scientists say that it kind of triggers oxytocin in our brain, right? It triggers a pleasurable feeling. And they've actually shown that it's very similar amount to the person telling the story or writing the story, which kind of shows that essentially what we're doing is we're putting ourselves in that story. We're almost feeling the feelings of the person telling or writing that story. Naturally, it appeals to us because it triggers those emotions, and it triggers that primal part of our brain. So there's the empathetic side, that natural empathy that we have. And the second way that it taps into the primal brain is through curiosity. So again, as humans, curiosity is a huge part of what makes us human. We're always looking to discover things, learn new things. It's just natural for us. That's where religion comes from. That's where science comes from. We want answers. We want to close information gaps. And the thing about a story is that it usually has an arc, right? It usually has a kind of beginning, middle, and an end, a narrative arc, we call it. And our brain once we begin, we naturally want to close that gap. We want to get to the end. It's just human nature. We're drawn by that curiosity. So if you begin a story and you manage to grab them with that first line, that first couple of lines, and you kind of open the loop, the information loop, our brains are just hardwired to want to close that loop. We just naturally want to close it. So again, I'm bringing this back to the initial challenge. I've talked about the primal brain, and the reason why I'm talking about it is because the primal part of our brain just works faster than the neocortex, which is what governs rational thinking, reason, logic, etc. And I can give you an example. If a tiger is coming right for you, right, you don't pause and think and try to, rationally think about how long and sharp its teeth are, right? You don't think about, let me weigh up the pros and cons of what's going to happen if it's going to eat me, the consequences. What happens is your instincts kick in, right? You think, shit, and you run, and that's it. You don't have time for reason and logic. So the primal part of the brain works more quickly. And back to our challenge of all that noise, when we're kind of scrolling through hundreds and thousands of pieces of content, we've got kind of content fatigue these days. So naturally, you need something that will tap in quickly, that will quickly grab attention and grab it and grip it. In order to kind of overcome that challenge, I would say that it's a very, very powerful thing to do in LinkedIn is to tap into, wherever possible, the primal part of the brain. And storytelling does that by arousing curiosity and intrigue. So that's the first kind of long-winded answer. And back to your second question, which was the future. The long-term goal as a business is to grow an audience, our following, grow our network. Why? Because the bigger audience you have, the top of the funnel, if you've got some nice funnel optimization going, then you should have more marketing qualified leads. You should have more than sales qualified leads. You should have more sales, more revenue. And that's the end goal for most businesses, right? In fact, probably all businesses is to grow revenue. So storytelling can help you grab more attention, grip the attention of more people. That will also help the algorithm as well, because the thing about LinkedIn is that what it does is it pushes your content out to a small group first, right? A small group of your first connections. If they just skim past it, it doesn't do what you're intending to do, which is increase dwell time, have them looking and reading and interacting and commenting and liking. If it doesn't do that with that small group, the algorithm won't push it out to a broader audience. So it's kind of restrictive. So in order to feed into the ego of LinkedIn's algorithm, you want to do that. You want to resonate. You want to get all of those metrics. So storytelling, as we said, can help you to increase attention, likes, comments, shares. That will in turn grow your reach from every post, and that will in turn grow your audience, and that will in turn grow your revenue, which is the end goal there. So for future goals, it's a powerful thing to do.
That's such a wonderful insight. I think what I really appreciate about your sharing is that you talk not just about the science and the art of storytelling, but also the psychological aspect of it, where it taps into the empathy side, it taps into the curiosity side, and then you also end it by talking about how, in the end, it brings to the long term, where the algorithm also plays a part in it, that you reach more people out there on LinkedIn. So thank you for giving us such a great insight on the present state of storytelling and why it's so important for the future, especially on LinkedIn. So we're going to dig deeper more on that in terms of LinkedIn and how do you do storytelling well. Now, you developed something called the 13 lenses methodology for sharpening copywriting. Yep. Can you tell us more about that and where does storytelling fit into this framework?
Yeah, sure. So the 13 lenses is a framework I developed in order to analyze and optimize copy and content at every step of the customer journey, and every stage of the funnel. It's almost like you could equate it to 13 different ingredients in the secret sauce of copy and content that works. Much like a sauce, you want to get the balance right. You want it to be salty, but not too salty, sweet, but not too sweet, acidic, but not too acidic. So when it comes to these 13 different lenses, it's all about balance in the end of the day and not focusing on any one lens too much. I'll give you a few examples. One lens, for example, is the brand lens. The brand lens is all about making sure your copy and content aligns with your core brand value proposition, brand narrative, brand values, brand voice, the audience that you're focusing on. That's a crucial thing that we need to do as copywriters and storytellers for business. Another lens, one of my favorites, is the goldfish lens. And that's all about making sure that your copy and content is tailored to the short attention spans of your audience, because these days in the digital world, we have very short attention spans. We have 20 tabs open. We have 20 things on our to-do list. We have between 4,000 and 10,000 ads being shoved in our face, in our eyes every single day. So naturally, you want to make sure that you tailor your copy to that. And just, again, without digging in too deep, a few tricks, simple wins are when you're writing content or copy, don't have big chunky paragraphs, right? A big chunky paragraph is just difficult for the eye to consume. When I see a big chunky paragraph, and when most people see one, they just think, screw it, I'm not going to read that, right? It's not easy to digest. Long sentences are harder to read. So chop down, choppy copy works. Also make your content skimmable and scannable, where possible, because a lot of people are skimming and scanning. So even if you're telling a story, if you want to insert some value into that story, written story, have some bullet points. Or in LinkedIn, a nice way to do it is with emojis rather than bullet points, because then the brain can instantly see and understand the pattern of what you're writing and how, look, there's 5 bullet points. It's easy to digest, and they can jump to them and they can skim and scan it. So that's the goldfish lens. And we have a primal brain lens. So I talked about that quite a lot. I love the primal brain lens. That's, as I said, all about really, making sure you're copying content, focus on emotions, instincts, all of those things, that kind of fast working part of the brain. Back to your question, how does storytelling fit in? I think that storytelling actually fits into a few of the lenses. There's a bit of overlap there, naturally. First of all, it fits into the primal brain lens for the reasons I mentioned. It also fits into a lens we call the creative spark lens. So the creative spark lens is all about injecting creativity into your copy and content. You can tick all of the other boxes, and especially as a B2B business, often companies do. They have their marketing strategy right. They're using real talk, conversational copy, etc. But sometimes it's just lacking that edge. It's lacking that creativity. And that means you can get swallowed up in a sea of sameness, of all those other brands that sound the same as you. So one way to be creative is to use storytelling, even if it's a few lines here and there, and to be more specific, you can use storytelling techniques and poetic devices like analogies, metaphors, similes, even things like alliteration. That's more kind of poetic than storytelling. You can create a narrative arc. And as I know, Wilson, kind of on your about page, for example, you can tell the story of the brand. So that kind of overlaps with the brand lens as well. Storytelling kind of fits into a few of those lenses because it's such a powerful thing that has a few different layers to it. You can use storytelling in an individual post on LinkedIn, for example. You can just tell a quick story, but you can also have a more kind of a broader brand story, brand narrative, which is something that you want to kind of always push and make sure all of your content links back to that kind of overarching narrative. So I hope that gives you a little taste of the 13 lenses.
Yeah, I think these lenses would be so helpful for a lot of people, not only on storytelling on LinkedIn, but I think their personal branding as well, and also for their brands and their companies and their businesses. So we'll also include the link in the show note so that you can check that out. So thank you, Konrad, for being willing to share this with us And I think they can also get connected with you. At the end, I'll ask for more information on how can they stay connected with you if they want to get some training or they want to get a service or the creative copywriter to help out their businesses and brands. So thank you for giving us an insight into the different lenses that you mentioned. Now let's dive deeper into today's episode title. And we're talking about building authority now on LinkedIn with the power of storytelling. Now, on this idea of trying to build authority on LinkedIn, do you think there's a difference between company and personal accounts? And how can you make them different with storytelling?
Yeah, a couple of good questions there. So the first thing I would say is that if you are not already a famous brand, if you don't already have a big audience, let's say you're kind of starting from scratch, or you're a small business owner, even probably SMEs in general, it can be quite hard, or harder at least, to get traction from LinkedIn on your business profile than a personal profile. And one thing you'll see a lot of on LinkedIn at the moment is, I mentioned it before, is personal brand building. And especially of the CEO, let's say, very quite common these days is for a company to focus on building the audience of the CEO of a brand. The reason for that, we can probably guess, but what is LinkedIn? It's a social media platform, right? With emphasis, social being the operative word there, right? We are social creatures. We go into social media platforms to socialize, to interact with other humans. There's that kind of old adage, people buy from people. Which is true. It makes sense. We are social creatures. We want to trust who we're buying from. Naturally, we're more inclined to connect with, engage with, and socialize with a face, a person, a human, than a company logo. So, what I'd say is that I think a great thing to do if you are especially a small business owner is to probably put more effort into building your personal brand, or someone in your company. And I say someone, it's actually a great thing to do more than one person. If you have all of your employees active and building their personal brands, that is what we call employee advocacy. It's so powerful because they're connected to your target audience. Usually they can build relationships, and you can really escalate and grow your reach that way. However, at the same time, it's still important to have a presence, right? It's still important to put content out on your business profile. You can still use, I would say, the same techniques. I still think you can use storytelling more so than most brands do. I think most of the time in LinkedIn business profiles, people just think, oh, B2B, let's just sell. There's too much selling going on, first of all, too much hard selling, too much promotion. What we want to do in LinkedIn generally is what we call soft selling, is building trust, as you said, building authority. So building, offering selfless value, teaching people, becoming like a credible authority in your niche, in your industry by talking about and solving the pain points of your target audience. You can do this as an individual. You can do this as a business profile. But again, for me, coming back to what is storytelling? Storytelling is a way of conveying information, basically. It's one way of conveying information, which again, we did as humans back in, as we were primal, our ancestors did it. That's how we passed down information. Believe it or not, we didn't have books, movies, the internet for most of humankind, but we did pass down information through stories because it's more memorable. As we said, I've mentioned this, it's more engaging, it's more intriguing, etc., etc. So business profiles can convey information. Even if you want to sell something, release a new product, you don't need to just hit them with facts and figures and kind of dull content or be overly salesy. You can tell a story. How did that product come about? Was there a customer pain point that happened? Maybe an individual customer that triggered some research, tell the story of what happened and then present the solution, which is your new product. So again, it's just, you can take almost any piece of information that you want to push out there into the world, and you can use storytelling as a way to tell it that will usually be more engaging and more interesting and get more likes and boost the algorithm and do all of the things that I mentioned. And I think that, how does that differ to an individual's, let's say CEO's or an employee's account? I think it's probably easier to tell more personal stories as an individual. And one thing about LinkedIn is that it's becoming more like Facebook in a way. It's becoming a place where people tell personal stories, which have nothing connected to their professional life. And it does well, because another thing about us as humans is that we're voyeurs, right? We want to know what's going on in other people's lives. again, I love going back to kind of like the primal humans, you know, as voyeurs, it helped us in social situations because we wanted to understand, you know, gossip is a huge part of what makes us human. The reason why it was very powerful to us is because it helped us understand who in our social groups was a bad egg, who was dangerous, right? Who was a dangerous person in that group. So that's why gossip is another important part of what makes us human. And when you're telling a personal story on LinkedIn, people just naturally are drawn to it. And if you put a selfies really work. There's so much evidence now. If you look at the posts in LinkedIn that do the best, they have a personal story, and B, some kind of selfie, because we're drawn to it. That human side, that primal brain is drawn to it. I think you could do more of that as an individual. But my argument is that as a business with your LinkedIn business page, you can still use storytelling, and you can maybe tell stories about individual employees, do a spotlight on someone, you know, because it's interesting, and it's easier for us to digest the story about one person than it is about an organization or a company or a nation or something like that. It's just easier for us. If it's one person, it's easier for us to put ourselves in their shoes and to empathize and to connect with that story.
Yeah.
So I hope that answers your question, Wilson.
Yeah, it does. I think that's a great distinction that you mentioned about like personal and also like a company account, because I think more and more now we are also seeing a lot of brands out there having brand ambassadors. For example, Piktochart, we have our own brand ambassador. And like what you said, the ideal situation is where there is employee advocacy, where your own employees are actually your ambassadors for your brand, going out there, reaching their own network. And also, I think your insight on sharing personal stories is also so important for us to consider about, because the way LinkedIn is, 10 years ago and now has changed significantly a lot. It used to be a place where people were just sharing about like their company updates, the growth we have. And now it has become more of a place of personal reflection, some of the things they do over the weekend. And I've seen that working very effectively. So I think it really taps into kind of what you said as well, where people really connect with people much better than just an organization where they listen to your story. So yeah, thank you for giving us that insight as well. I think that's something that we can all see very evidently on LinkedIn these days. Now we talk a little bit about the top of the funnel content that you mentioned earlier just now. In particular, for a brand's LinkedIn account, how do you think storytelling on LinkedIn factor into a brand's top of the funnel content?
First, I'll describe or tell you how we define top of the funnel content at the Creative Copywriter. We try to simplify things in a way. And for me, top of the funnel content, generally the goal is to attract and engage. Mid funnel content is to kind of hook and nurture. Bottom funnel content is to convince and convert. And we actually coined another term, after funnel content, so AFU content, which is after the sale, which basically the job there is to make them spend more, right? Increase customer lifetime value, but also turn them into brand advocates. And those people can actually bring more people into the top of the funnel if they're sharing your content, etc. So back to top of the funnel content. Yeah, I think LinkedIn is a perfect place for it. Again, mentioning those two words, attract, engage, and to expand on that, I think that often what we're doing, especially in the B2B world, is providing value, selfless value, educating, building a relationship, building authority, becoming a thought leader, right? And to be a thought leader, you need to kind of create content that adds value to the lives of your target audience, that solves their pain points, that educates them. And LinkedIn is a perfect platform for that, and back to kind of storytelling, like I said, it's a way of conveying information. So what we don't want to do, I think for some reason, what's becoming more difficult these days because of the noise I mentioned before, is just to give some tips, just to kind of create value like we did, like you would in a blog post, right? Because again, we want to, for some reason in LinkedIn, people are looking for those things that will catch their attention. And as we said, a story is a great way to bring people into any kind of information that you're offering. So what we might do, for example, is start with a quick story, kind of give them a teaser. I might say, for example, part of my content that I write on LinkedIn, part of it is talking about copywriting and content strategy, but part of it is talking about agency growth, right? The agency side, and my agency story. So I might start by a LinkedIn post by going, I'm ready to throw in the towel. I'm burnt out. I've had this really difficult week. And I'm telling the story of the week and how it's been really tough. And I'm creating a bit of kind of intrigue there. I'm creating like, oh, he's burnt out. It's what I want to know why. And as the voyeur, I want to understand and see more, which is very important. Click that button, see more. And I can tell a bit about the story, but then I can go, and now here are 10 tips on how how I've avoided and how you can avoid burnout. So I can provide that value. I can be a thought leader in that sphere. I can offer that information. But what I've done is I've enticed them in with a story. I've built that intrigue. I've enticed them in. So I've kind of combined two techniques there. And we often do that, to be honest, the same in blog posts as well. We start with a little bit of a story, right, to kind of entice them in, trigger the empathy, trigger the curiosity. But then then there's a breakdown of like, here's the value, here are the tips, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So yeah, hope that answers the question.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great example that you mentioned, especially bringing back also to how a blog post works, where there's an introduction to entice you, and people are always drawn towards story. And I guess that's also one of the ways to see how can we strategize that story as part of our top to funnel content. So thank you for giving us an example, even on your own personal post, and how we can also do that on our own. Now, you have a lot of experience in copywriting. You mentioned about you starting back in your university days to where you are today. So based on that, if you are speaking with, for example, a new or aspiring with business leader, what would be your top 3 tips for great storytelling on LinkedIn to build authority?
Great question as well. I think I've probably alluded to some of them, but if I had to give 3, if you're forcing me to give just 3, I would say, first of all, contrast. So use contrast. And, I'm talking a lot about the primal brain today, so I'm going to continue talking about it because I just think, as I said, for many reasons, it's what draws people in, and that's what we need to do. Now, contrast is something that is quite important for the primal brain because the primal brain is kind of stupid, right? It's kind of silly, right? It does things before thinking, before rationalizing. And if there isn't that level of contrast, if there's no contrast, it can be a bit murky. It can be confusing for our primal brain. And by contrast, I'll give you a quick example, maybe before and after, right? You've seen like someone that's kind of lost weight, right? And they've gone through this program to lose a lot of weight, and they show a picture, an image of before and after, wherever that is, on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. Immediately it taps into that primal brain. We see that contrast and it creates an emotion. We can empathize, we can understand it very clearly. And when it comes to storytelling, one way to create contrast is with a very simple narrative arc, like a rags to riches arc, for example. Rags to riches is a very simple narrative arc. We talk about, I kind of sort of gave you that story about how I started my agency in the bedroom of my girlfriend's parents' house with no money, kind of bootstrapped it. And now at the end of the story, I'm running successful agencies with clients like Adidas, TikTok, etc. That is a very quick narrative I've just given you, a rags to riches, arguably, story, where there's contrast there's immediate contrast. So that's something you can do in LinkedIn. You can tell the story of where you came from to now. But it could be the opposite. It could almost be riches to rags, the opposite kind of arc in a way. And that contrast, again, it's just an easy way to kind of grab eyeballs, get attention, and tap into that primal part of the brain. That's tip 1. Tip 2 is creating curiosity. So I mentioned that stories do that naturally, but you can push that curiosity a bit harder. So a very important part of real estate for your LinkedIn post is kind of above the fold. You've only got space for a couple of sentences before they either click see more or they don't. That's so crucial. Just like on a landing page, the header, the subheader, right? It's like the most important part of your landing page. For us, with the LinkedIn post, other than the image or the video, that copy above the fold is the most important part. The job of it is to intrigue them enough to see more, to click see more. So when it comes to using storytelling, open that information gap, right? Use what we call the curiosity gap. So, start with the end of the story, like tease the ending by saying, I'm ready to throw in the towel, right? By saying that, I've created a bit of almost contrast there. Like I'm intriguing them. I'm giving them this like ending to the story. Like why are you ready to throw in the towel? Why are you ready to give up on your business? By saying that in that top kind of above the fold part of the LinkedIn post, you're opening this information gap. They'll naturally want to understand why, because you're tapping into curiosity. Clickbait does it really well. So clickbait gets a bad rep. You see more clickbait in Facebook, for example. It has a bad reputation for good reason, because I think they do it too much. Tom Cruise did something and you never guess what happened next. Or, they play into this human psychology of arousing curiosity. And even those that understand it, marketers like me, every now and then I have to click it. I just can't stop because my rational brain is too slow. I'm like, I need to know what's going on. The reason clickbait gets a bad reputation is because usually you end up on a very crappy article, which is, littered with ads, and it's bad quality, right? But essentially the psychology that clickbaiters use, we want to use above the fold in our LinkedIn posts, but without pushing it so hard. And when they open, you don't want them to be disappointed. You want to tell an interesting, valuable, engaging story. That's tip 2. Tip 3 is, if possible, talk about one person. Stories are always interesting, but it's easier for us to digest it if you are telling a story about an individual. Usually that's going to be you if you're a brand ambassador or someone representing a brand, because we are, as I mentioned, interested we're voyeurs, we're interested in that person. We can empathize with you if it's a story about one person. So again, if it's a business telling a story, like I mentioned, you might be telling a story of an employee or a story of one client, the client case study story. What was the challenge that client had? How did you overcome it? That also creates contrast, right? A case study story is the contrast of this pain point, this challenge, and agitate the pain point, and then talk about how as a business you helped that one client overcome it. Then, other people in the same boat will empathize and go, oh, that's like me. And they'll, it's a case study story is a great way to convince and convert people. So I think that was 3.
Yeah, that was 3.
Was that 3?
And 3 really solid tips as well. You talk about contrast, curiosity, and in the end, also bringing it back to making the story personal. So I think customizing it, to the case study or to your customer or to your employee, I think those are really great tips. So thank you so much for giving us so many valuable lessons. And I'm sure you could go on and on, but I think those 3 tips alone are just really good for us and business leaders to consider. So thank you for that. Well, we are in our second final question now. And I'm sure our listeners are also curious about this. You talked a little bit about the creative copywriter earlier. So how has storytelling benefited your agency as a brand on LinkedIn?
For us, being a small business, as I mentioned before, what we've mainly done is focus on building up my personal brand. So we kind of focus a little bit. We do have our own business page content going out there, but really the focus has more been on me as the sort of brand ambassador, if you will. Me with my hat out there, creating content, doing all of the things we mentioned, talking about my personal life, but mixing it up, getting that blend right. You don't just want to talk about personal stories. And one thing I see on LinkedIn too much, in my opinion, is I think people trying to hack the algorithm too much and get caught up in vanity metrics. I think there's a bit of oversharing, talking about the biggest tragedies in their lives, but they're not bringing it back to kind of their brand value proposition. Like, what's it got to do with their professional life? You can share stories, but I see people just doing that, and I don't know what they do. I don't know what they bring to the table. I don't know what their personal value proposition is. I don't know what their brand value proposition is. So I think my point is here, get the blend right, get the mix right. So what we've been doing for me is, I share content about copywriting, content strategy, psychology, and I also tell personal stories of, sometimes I use contrast, sometimes I, pander to the algorithm because you need to. And I use storytelling as a technique for all the reasons we mentioned to kind of grow my following. There's still work to do, but it's increasing. One kind of quick, easy, tangible win that I can give you is, Mercedes-Benz, one of our clients, they came to us through LinkedIn. So that win was attributable to, growing my following on LinkedIn, because that was a win there. So it's helped us win prospects, to grow our audience and actually win business. So there's clear ROI from growing my personal brand on LinkedIn and using storytelling as one of the techniques.
Yeah, that's really encouraging to hear as well, because I think we talk a lot about building authority on LinkedIn, and now we're going to hear, a true story of yours and how you managed to get a big client, because of what you all are doing with your personal account, and it ultimately led back to the value proposition of the creative copywriter. So thank you for also sharing on that note. And we're in our final question now. Now, I'm sure you have seen a lot of individuals or brands out there that are doing storytelling well on LinkedIn. Now, if you could narrow it down, what are some of your favorite examples of those who are doing storytelling well? At the same time, also they're building their authority with their value proposition.
I'll give you one individual that I think is great to follow. So Dave Harland, the word man, he's a copywriter and uses a lot of storytelling. It's quite extreme what he does, but he's really carved out his own niche, his own brand, where he tells like these really long fictional stories. I would usually advise you tell real stories, but he tells these hilarious fictional stories. It's kind of tongue-in-cheek, sarcastic. He kind of almost takes the piss out of some of the kind of thought leaders out there who kind of are throwing out these very generic one-liners which don't really have much meaning. And I think he just used storytelling in a really clever, creative way. And I think he's a great person to follow. He's got a huge following. So he's got a huge following from doing this consistently. So Dave Harland, the word man, I think is a great person to follow.
I think that's a really unique one, and I'll definitely be following him. So thank you for giving that suggestion for our listeners to also follow so that they can be inspired through that. Well, Konrad, thank you so much for sharing so many valuable and insightful takeaways with us today. I personally have certainly gained a lot of new learnings myself on building authority on LinkedIn with the power of storytelling. And I trust that our listeners have also benefited from your sharing in this episode. Now, as a wrap up, I'd love to ask you some fun questions to help our listeners learn about what inspires you. What is a recent movie or TV show that you have enjoyed for their storytelling?
Recent movie, The Peanut Butter Falcon. I don't know if you've seen that with Shia LaBeouf. Just such a great story. Again, it's kind of like almost like a Mark Twain novel. It's about a guy in the deep south going on this adventure, like these two guys, and I thoroughly recommend.
Yeah, I've been recommended that movie. I've seen the trailer, but never had a chance. So I'm definitely going to watch it now based on your recommendation. Now, in related to storytelling again, what are some apps or tools that you would recommend to help inspire storytelling?
I don't have any apps and tools, but I would just say read lots of books, watch movies, and kind of try to think about what is that narrative arc? What can you learn from it? So maybe pause and reflect. Why did you enjoy it? What was it about that movie or that book or that TV show that really drew you in? I know it doesn't quite answer the question, but I think for us it's any kind of good show, any good movie really has a strong story there, and you can.
No, I think that's a great one because for storytellers like ourselves, every time we see something that we enjoy, we always think about how do they tell this story effectively? How do they tell so well? So I think personal reflection is something that's important, maybe more important than an app or tool that can inspire our storytelling. And finally, my question for you is this: if you are not doing what you're doing today at the Creative Copywriter, what do you envision yourself doing?
I actually am also into doing street art. So I kind of have a bit of an art background and music. So creatively, I kind of spread myself a bit thin, but creating music and art are kind of passions of mine. And arguably there's a bit of storytelling in both, if we want to connect all of the dots there. So I'd love to kind of have more time to do both of those. So yeah, all three kind of writing, art and music.
Yeah, and I think the most effective music and art is also in their storytelling. So I hope one day you'll be able to pursue that, maybe on the side as well, based on your time. So yeah, that was fun getting to know you better, and thank you for being a good sport by answering these fun questions. I'm sure our listeners have also enjoyed knowing you better and what inspires you as a person. Now, before I conclude, for our listeners who'd like to reach you or stay connected with you to learn more about the lenses or how they can get the service of the Creative Copywriter, how can they do that?
Well, I think follow me on LinkedIn. So it's Konrad Sanders. The spelling of the name, I'm sure, will be somewhere here where they can read it. And I'll give you a link, Wilson, to an ebook that we created about the 13 lenses. And you can check out our website, which is creative-copywriter.net. And we have a blog there, naturally, with lots of storytelling. So I think all of those three things, but, we'll share some links, I believe, where you can quite easily find me.
Thank you for being so
LinkedIn
generous.
and on our
And we'll
website.
be sure to also include those links in the show notes so that our listeners can check them out. So yeah, feel free to stay in touch with Konrad and reach him if you'd like to know more about the Creative Copywriter and how they can help your brand to tell better stories. Once again, thank you, Konrad, for coming on this episode of the Business Storyteller Podcast. That's all for today, and until the next one. We hope you find this episode valuable. If you'd like to hear more, be sure to follow our podcast on Spotify or check out piktochart.com/podcast to see the rest of our episodes. The Business Storyteller Podcast is brought to you by Piktochart, an intuitive platform for visual creation and video editing. Join more than 8 million people who are already using Piktochart to enhance their storytelling through infographics, presentations, and videos. Find out more at piktochart.com and sign up for a free account to get started. Once again, thank you for listening to the Business Storyteller Podcast, and we'll catch you at the next one.